At dawn, on July 1st, 1916, the fields of northern France were quiet. A thin mist hung over the rolling countryside near the River Somme. Birds still sang, and the grass moved gently in the morning breeze. For a brief moment, the land appeared untouched by the vast war that had already consumed much of Europe. Yet beneath this calm surface, more than 100,000 men waited inside narrow trenches, carved deep into the earth. British and French soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, gripping their rifles and adjusting the heavy packs on their backs. Many of them were young. Many had never seen real combat, and most believed what they had been told. They believed that days of relentless artillery bombardment had destroyed the German defenses ahead of them. They believed the enemy was exhausted, demoralized, and unable to resist. Officers assured them that this attack would be decisive, that the hardest part of the battle had already been fought by the guns. They were tragically mistaken. When the whistles blew and the soldiers climbed out of their trenches, they stepped into a reality far more brutal than anything they had imagined. The German machine guns were intact. The barbed wire remained uncut. The enemy waited, sheltered deep underground, ready to fire. Within minutes, entire waves of men were cut down in open fields with nowhere to hide. Courage, discipline, and obedience offered no protection against the storm of bullets that followed. By the end of that single day, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, a scale of loss so vast that it stunned the nation. Whole communities would soon receive telegrams announcing deaths that arrived faster than families could comprehend. The illusion of a short and glorious war collapsed under the weight of unimaginable suffering. The Battle of the Somme was more than a military operation. It was a symbol of how industrial warfare had outgrown human understanding. Technology had advanced faster than strategy, and men paid the price. The first day of the Somme exposed a terrible truth, that bravery alone could not survive modern war, and that the old rules of battle no longer applied. This was not merely the story of a failed attack. It was the moment when mass death became a defining feature of warfare. To understand how this tragedy unfolded and why so many lives were lost in a matter of hours, we must look deeper into the plans, the assumptions, and the decisions that led to one of the darkest days in military history. By the summer of 1916, the First World War had already shattered the expectations of every nation involved. What many believed would be a short and decisive conflict had turned into a grinding stalemate stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Along this vast front, opposing armies faced each other across a tangled landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and shell craters. Month after month, millions of men lived underground, enduring mud, disease, and constant danger. While generals searched desperately for a way to break the deadlock, the Western Front had become a battlefield unlike anything the world had ever seen. Advances were measured not in miles, but in yards, often paid for with thousands of lives. Artillery dominated the battlefield, pulverizing the land until it resembled a barren wasteland. Yet even the heaviest bombardments rarely delivered decisive results. Defensive positions were deep, reinforced, and protected by machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Attacking forces found themselves repeatedly slaughtered as they crossed open ground. By early 1916, pressure on the Allied leadership was intense. France, which had borne the brunt of the fighting since the beginning of the war, was nearing exhaustion. In February, the German army launched a massive assault on the French fortress city of Verdun. The battle quickly turned into a brutal struggle of attrition, with both sides pouring men into a deadly contest that seemed to have no end. French losses mounted at an alarming rate, and the French government urgently needed relief. The answer, Allied leaders believed, lay in a major offensive elsewhere along the Western Front. This new attack would force Germany to divert troops away from Verdun and finally achieve the long-awaited breakthrough. The chosen location was a quiet sector along the river, some in northern France, where British and French forces met. It was here that one of the largest offensives in history would be launched. For the British Army, the Somme represented more than a strategic necessity. It was a test of transformation. Since 1914, Britain had expanded its military at an unprecedented speed. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers had answered the call to arms, forming what became known as Kitchener's Army. These men were clerks, factory workers, miners, teachers, and students who had never imagined themselves as soldiers. They trained together, lived together, and in many cases enlisted alongside friends, brothers, and neighbors in what were called PALS battalions. The enthusiasm of these volunteers was genuine, but experience was limited. Many had only recently completed their training, and few had seen real combat. Their officers, often drawn from civilian life, faced similar challenges. Despite their dedication, the British Army of 1916 lacked the battlefield experience of its German counterpart, which had been fighting continuously since the war began. The plan for the Somme offensive was built on confidence in modern firepower. Allied commanders believed that a prolonged artillery bombardment could destroy German defenses, cut their barbed wire, collapse their trenches, and kill or demoralize the defenders. If successful, infantry would be able to advance across no man's land with minimal resistance, occupy the enemy trenches, and exploit the breakthrough. In preparation, the Allies unleashed one of the most intense bombardments ever attempted. For 7 days, beginning on June 24, 1916, more than 1.5 million shells were fired at German positions. The noise was deafening, shaking the ground day and night. Soldiers were told that nothing could survive such punishment. Many were assured that the German soldiers would be dead or too stunned to fight. But this confidence was dangerously misplaced. German defenses along the Somme were far stronger than Allied intelligence suggested. Over months and years, German engineers had constructed deep underground bunkers, some reaching more than 30 feet below the surface. These shelters protected troops from even the heaviest shells. When the bombardment began, German soldiers simply retreated underground, waiting patiently for it to end. Compounding the problem, many of the Allied shells were defective. A significant number failed to explode at all, burying themselves harmlessly in the soft chalk soil. Others lacked the power to cut through thick barbed wire. When the bombardment finally lifted, much of the German defensive network remained intact. Despite warning signs, the attack went ahead as planned. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1, 1916, the whistles blew along a front nearly 20 miles wide. British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began to advance at a walking pace. They had been ordered to move steadily, not to run, maintaining formation as they crossed the open ground. Heavy packs weighed them down, and rifles were carried at the ready. Ahead of Diem, German machine gun crews emerged from their bunkers. What followed was devastation on a scale few could comprehend. Machine guns tore through advancing lines, cutting men down in rows. Artillery fire joined in, and rifles picked off those who tried to crawl or take cover. In many sectors, soldiers fell within seconds of leaving their trenches. Officers were killed attempting to lead their men forward. Communication collapsed as telephone lines were severed and runners were shot. Some units managed to reach the German lines, fighting fiercely in close combat and briefly capturing trenches. But these successes were isolated and costly. Without support, they could not be held. In most areas, the attack failed almost immediately, leaving the ground littered with the wounded and the dead. By midday, it was clear that the offensive had not achieved its objectives. Yet in many places, attacks continued throughout the day, driven by rigid orders and the belief that persistence might still bring success. Each renewed effort added to the toll. The first day of the Somme ended with gains measured in yards and losses measured in tens of thousands. It marked a grim awakening for the British Army and the nation it represented. The reality of industrial warfare had been laid bare, and the cost of misunderstanding it was written across the fields of northern France. And this was only the beginning. As the morning of July 1, 1916 wore on, the battlefield of the Somme descended into chaos. Smoke from artillery and burning earth drifted across the landscape, obscuring vision and muffling sound. What had been planned as a coordinated advance quickly fractured into countless isolated struggles, each fought by small groups of men who no longer knew where their neighboring units were or whether support would ever arrive. For the soldiers caught in no man's land, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Wounded men lay exposed under the sun, calling for help that could not reach them. Medics tried to move forward, often becoming casualties themselves. The ground offered little protection. Shell holes filled with shattered bodies and torn equipment, while barbed wire trapped the living among the dead. Every attempt to move drew enemy fire, forcing survivors to press themselves into the dirt and wait. In the British trenches behind the lines, confusion reigned. Officers struggled to understand what was happening at the front. Communication systems failed almost immediately, as telephone wires were cut by shell fire and runners were killed before reaching their destinations. Reports that did arrive were fragmented and often contradictory. Some spoke of limited successes, while others described complete destruction. Without clear information, Higher Command continued to issue orders based on the original plan rather than the reality unfolding on the ground. The German defenders, meanwhile, acted with brutal efficiency. Having endured the artillery bombardment in deep shelters, they emerged to find much of their defensive network intact. Machine gun teams quickly took up pre-planned firing positions, sweeping the open fields with devastating accuracy. Artillery observers directed fire onto advancing troops, turning carefully prepared killing zones into scenes of mass slaughter. For them, the battlefield was chaotic, but their purpose was clear. One of the most tragic aspects of the first day was the fate of the PALS battalions. These units, formed from men who had enlisted together from the same towns and workplaces, advanced almost side by side. When they were cut down, entire communities suffered simultaneously. In Somme tones, a single morning erased nearly a generation of young men. The social impact of these losses would be felt for decades, long after the war itself had ended. Despite the carnage, acts of extraordinary bravery occurred across the front. Individual soldiers pressed on alone after their comrades had fallen. Small groups fought their way into enemy trenches, engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Officers attempted to rally survivors under relentless fire. These moments of courage, however, could not overcome the fundamental imbalance between attackers exposed in the open and defenders protected by prepared positions. As afternoon turned to evening, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Casualty clearing stations overflowed with wounded men. Surgeons worked without rest, performing amputations and emergency procedures under horrific conditions. Stretcher bearers moved back and forth through shell fire, often forced to leave men behind when it became too dangerous to continue. The cries of the injured echoed across the battlefield, long after the fighting in some sectors had ceased. Yet even as the losses mounted, the offensive did not entirely stop. In certain areas, commanders believed progress was still possible. Additional attacks were ordered, sometimes with little knowledge of the destruction already suffered. Fresh troops advanced into the same deadly conditions, encountering the same unbroken defenses. Each renewed effort added to the growing list of casualties, reinforcing the tragic pattern of the day. By nightfall, the battlefield presented a grim spectacle. The ground between the lines was strewn with bodies, many lying where they had fallen hours earlier. Some of the wounded remained alive, calling out in the darkness. A fragile, unofficial stillness settled over parts of the front as both sides tended to their own. In places, Germans and British soldiers cautiously ventured out under a cover of night to retrieve the wounded, a rare moment of shared humanity amid the devastation. For those who survived, the psychological impact was profound. The first day of the Somme shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of the war. Soldiers who had entered the battle with confidence in their training and leadership now understood how vulnerable they truly were. Fear, exhaustion, and grief set in, mixed with a sense of disbelief at the scale of loss they had witnessed. News of the catastrophe traveled slowly back to Britain. Initial reports were vague, and censorship limited the details released to the public. Many families remained unaware of what had happened for days, or even weeks. When casualty lists were finally published, they stretched on 4 pages, town by town, regiment by regiment. The shock was national, even if the full horror of the battlefield was still difficult to grasp. The first day of the Somme did not end the battle. Instead, it marked the beginning of a campaign that would drag on for months. Despite the failure of July 1st, the offensive continued, driven by the belief that perseverance would eventually wear down the enemy. The fields that had absorbed so much blood on that single day would see even more fighting in the weeks to come. The tragedy of the first day lay not only in the numbers lost, but in what it revealed about modern warfare. It exposed the deadly consequences of outdated tactics, overconfidence in technology, and a failure to adapt quickly enough to new realities. The Somme became a harsh lesson written in human lives, one that would influence how wars were fought in the future. And yet, for the men who endured it, that knowledge came at an unbearable cost. When the sun rose over the Somme on July 2nd, 1916, the battlefield told a silent story. The ground was torn apart, the air still heavy with smoke, and the space between the opposing lines was covered with the bodies of men who had fallen the day before. For many of the wounded who had survived the night, rescue finally came, though for countless others it arrived too late. The battle had moved on, but the memory of that first day would never fade. Despite the catastrophic losses of July 1st, the offensive did not end. Instead, The Battle of the Somme continued for more than 4 months, grinding forward through villages, forests, and shattered farmland. Attacks were launched again and again, often for small territorial gains that came at a high price. New weapons appeared on the battlefield, including the first use of tanks in warfare, introduced in an attempt to break the stalemate that had defined the conflict. While these machines showed promise, they were unreliable and few in number, unable to deliver the decisive breakthrough commanders hoped for. By the time the fighting finally ended in November 1916, the scale of destruction was staggering. More than 1 million men on both sides had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. The landscape of the Somme was permanently altered. Its fields churned into a scarred wasteland. Entire villages had been erased, and the land itself seemed to bear witness to the violence that had unfolded upon it. In strategic terms, the results of the battle were deeply contested. The Allies had advanced several miles and succeeded in drawing German forces away from Verdun, easing the pressure on the French army. The German army, in turn, suffered heavy losses that it could ill afford. Yet for many observers, these outcomes seemed painfully inadequate when weighed against the human cost. The Somme became a symbol of sacrifice on an almost unimaginable scale, raising difficult questions about leadership, strategy, and the value of persistence in war. For the British Army, the Somme marked a painful but significant transformation. The citizen soldiers of 1916 endured one of the harshest trials in military history, and those who survived emerged hardened by experience. Lessons were learned, slowly and at great costs. Tactics evolved, coordination between infantry and artillery improved, and a more flexible approach to warfare began to take shape. While these changes did not come quickly enough to save the men lost on the first day, they influenced the course of the war in the years that followed. Beyond the battlefield, the impact of the Somme reached deep into society. Communities across Britain and the wider empire mourned the loss of sons, brothers, and fathers. The concentration of casualties within specific units meant that grief was often shared collectively, reshaping towns and villages overnight. Memorials would later be built bearing long lists of names, each representing a life cut short in the fields of northern France. The battle also left a lasting mark on culture and memory. Writers, poets, and artists who experienced the war firsthand struggled to capture its reality. Their works reflected disillusionment, sorrow, and a rejection of romanticized visions of combat. The Somme, and especially its first day, came to represent the collapse of old ideas about honor and glory in war, replaced by a more somber understanding of its true nature. Today, the Somme remains a place of remembrance. The fields that once echoed with gunfire are now quiet, dotted with cemeteries where rows of white headstones stretch into the distance. Many of the men buried there have no known grave, their names inscribed on memorials to the missing. Visitors walk these grounds in silence, confronted by the scale of loss and the weight of history beneath their feet. The first day of the Somme stands as a warning as much as a memory. It reminds us of the consequences of underestimating the destructive power of modern warfare and the cost of rigid thinking in the face of change. It shows how quickly human lives can be consumed when planning fails to match reality, and how courage alone cannot overcome systemic flaws. Yet within this tragedy, there is also a call to remember the individuals who lived through it. Each soldier who stepped out of the trench carried hopes, fears, and a future that was never realized. Their stories, though often reduced to statistics, deserve to be acknowledged as part of our shared human past. The Somme was not simply a battle fought over a territory. It was a defining moment that reshaped armies, nations, and the way war itself was understood. Its legacy endures not in victories or defeats, but in the lessons written in blood on a single summer day in 1916. And as long as that day is remembered, the men who fell there are not forgotten.